Welcome designers to another tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about composition. Specifically, we're going to be editing some really bad compositions, and we're going to try to use 5 compositional guidelines using the overlapping, rotating, cropping, creating a focal point, and using the rule of thirds technique so that we can improve upon these compositions. These are not going to be award-winning compositions. I'm not going to show you guys some really advanced techniques today. Today it's all about just correcting some really bad compositions and creating something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. We're going to start with our first artboard, and here you can see that I'm zooming in on the template so I can really focus on the very first artboard, where you guys are going to be using the overlapping technique to take all these fruits and basically create a more aesthetically pleasing composition with them. So I'm opening all of the layers in my artboard by clicking on that little arrow to expand them. And I'm not doing anything fancy here. I enabled my grid by going to the view menu at the top, and I selected extras so I would be able to see the grid. I recommend you guys have the grid visible to help you position all of the items on your artboards. And here I'm just using free transform. The shortcut, as you guys will recall, is Control T, and I'm just moving it over. I started with one piece of fruit, that really large papaya piece, because I felt like it could frame the whole of the still life I'm creating with the fruit. And then I'm literally just working one-on-one. I can see some fruit pieces should probably be enlarged, some should be rotated, some should be positioned on the side. So this is all about just kind of like putting a puzzle together, repositioning the pieces, and figuring out what's the most attractive arrangement. Now that I'm done rearranging and resizing the fruit on my composition, I am actually going to hold down Control and click on every layer. Then I'm going to hold down Control G, and what this will do is it's going to group all of my layers and put them in this little file folder that you can see in the layers panel. And what makes this easy is that when I'm going to apply simultaneous edits to these layers, it'll apply to the group overall. I'll show you momentarily what I mean. You can see here I'm just going and sampling some colors from the image so I can change that bright intense yellow of the background. And now I pressed that group layer and I went to FX, and I'm just applying a subtle drop shadow to the fruits. And what you guys will notice is that the fruits all now have a drop shadow because I applied it to the group overall. So I don't have to apply it to the strawberry or the banana individually. I can just go and apply edits simultaneously, and this saves a lot of time and effort. Moving on to the next artboard, here I'm asking you guys to show a focal point with the 2 pieces of text that I provided for you. So you need to emphasize one of these words. I want to emphasize Trojan. So the first thing I need to do to emphasize the text is select an attention-grabbing font. You also want to consider using scale, using color, using effects, and maybe capitalizing so that you can make a certain word stand out and have that be the very first thing that the viewer looks at. So here, I'm actually just going and enlarging the word Trojan. You can enlarge and change the font using the options in the options bar when you select your type tool. But if you actually go and open your character panel, you also have more options available to you for how you can edit the text. Remember, you can open your character panel by clicking on that little clipboard icon in your options bar with the type tool selected, or you can go to the Windows menu at the top of your workspace. You can see here that I'm actually repeating some of these steps for the word pride, but what I'm going to do so that I can draw attention to Trojan and not so much for pride is I'm actually increasing the tracking or the space between letter forms for the word pride. Now you guys don't need to do this. I chose to do it, and I just want to be able to have both of these words be aligned without necessarily making them both the same size, because I want Trojan to be my focal point. Here I'm just going and dragging out some guides because you guys know I am very anal about alignment. So you can always click on your rulers and drag a guide so that you guys can go and align your two text layers as nicely as possible. Now that both text layers are perfectly aligned, I really want to call the viewer's attention to the word Trojan. And you guys know I love gradient overlays and I love layer effects. So I'm going down to FX at the bottom of my layers panel, and I'm applying a gradient overlay effect to the text. I want to use warm colors like oranges and pinks and reds to really call people's attention. Now, momentarily, I will be getting rid of that god-awful yellow background, but you want to think about what colors you're going to use on the text to really grab people's attention. You also know that I love drop shadows and I love strokes. So if you're going to use either of those effects like I'll be doing shortly, please do so subtly because you don't want the text to look cheesy. So you can see here I'm applying a really subtle drop shadow and I'm adjusting the distance and the size because the settings that I had used previously for the previous artboard just don't work. So please make sure you guys are adjusting those settings if you're going to be using a drop shadow, a stroke, a gradient overlay, or any other kind of effect. When you're selecting a background color, all you have to do is double click the color fill layer and you're going to see the color picker panel. If you drag your mouse over an image on your artboard, you can sample the color of the image so that you can match it to your backgrounds, which is what I had done to match the avocado green to that pale green background. In this case, however, I'm basically just using some complementary colors and I am using a pale blue to complement some of the oranges that are used in the text overall. You can see I copied and pasted some of the layer effects to the second text layer. You can do so by right-clicking on the text layer, selecting Copy Layer Effects, and then pasting it to the layer that you want to target. But to bring a little less attention to the word pride, I'm adjusting the effects again. I am using a color overlay instead of a gradient so that you can clearly read the word pride, but Trojan is 100% my focal point. The third artboard uses a rotate technique, and this one is very easy for anyone to understand. You're not doing anything fancy here, you're just using free transform so that you can rotate the scissors and put them in different directions to lead the viewer's eyes from one end to another. So the scissors kind of function like arrows in that they are guiding the viewer from point A to point B. And here you can see how I'm repositioning them, enlarging them, because if they're all the same size, there's not going to be a focal point. It's just going to be a very sad, tacky composition if they're all the same size floating in space. So I'm using one layer one at a time, and I'm basically just figuring out how I can present them so that they create an interesting composition that will guide the viewer from point A to point B. Once again, I'm changing that god-awful yellow background, and you can see how I'm going and double-clicking on the color fill layer and then dragging my mouse over some of the scissor handles or the actual blade itself just so that I can get a slightly more subtle color. I'm also going to repeat my steps that I demonstrated earlier, holding down Control, using Control G so I can group those layers, and then I'm gonna finish off my design using a very subtle drop shadow effect. You guys know I'm kind of a drop shadow maniac. I think it just adds a little je ne sais quoi. It makes it look a little bit more finished, more three-dimensional. And again, if you're gonna use drop shadows, go subtle. You don't want to drop. For our fourth artboard, we are going to be using the cropping technique. This one's very simple. You're trying to draw visual interest in some kind of shape or object on your composition, so you are extending that object past the edges of the canvas and doing an extreme zoom on some part of the object that you really want to show off. So I'm keeping it really easy for you guys, and I created these geometric shapes, and all I'm doing is repeating my steps from previous artboards where I'm resizing and rotating and repositioning all of these objects to create harmony. I realized that 4 shapes was way too much, so I ended up deleting 1 because I want to use a rule of odds, which states that you use an odd number of objects to create visual harmony. So if one of these is not working out for you, don't stress about it, just delete it. Eventually, we're going to be filling each of these shapes with patterns and applying layer effects to finish them off with a stroke and finish them off with color. But for right now, all you have to do is think about a different composition you can create by enlarging the shapes, having the edges go past the artboard, and positioning them to create visual interest. I'm working with each shape layer individually, and I'm going back to my shape tool so that I can enable my options bar settings. And in this case, I didn't want to apply a gradient, I didn't want to apply a solid color. So I'm actually using the last option from my fill, and I'm actually going and filling each of these shapes with patterns. You can install more patterns by going to brusheasy.com and following a process similar to installing brushes. For this, however, I'm just using some of the default patterns included within Photoshop, and I'm increasing the scale so that I can see the details within the pattern a little bit more clearly within each shape. Then I'm flipping over to stroke to the right of fill on the options bar so that I can apply an interesting color to the black outline bordering each of the shapes. As before, I'm dragging my mouse over the image, in this case a pattern image, so that I can match some of the colors within the pattern to apply to the stroke and have a far more harmonious design. I'm also going to be, once again, double-clicking on the yellow color fill layer so that I can change that god-awful yellow and match one of the colors being used within the patterns filling the shapes. It's a very easy artboard for you guys to fix. All you need to do is resize the elements, apply some interesting patterns, play around with scale, and you're done. For our very last artboard, we need to make sure our rulers are enabled because we're going to be creating the rule of thirds grid. So please go to View and Rulers and ensure that they are visible because you are going to be clicking on the rulers and dragging out guides so that you can place 2 vertical guides and 2 horizontal guides evenly spaced on your artboards to create the rule of thirds. As I explained to you guys in class, with the rule of thirds, you want to place your most important objects bordering the intersecting points in the grid. So as you can see, I'm deciding here that that plate with the cheesecake should be my focal point. So I'm enlarging it and moving it closer to the foreground because it's the first thing the viewer would see. And I'm making sure that I'm overlapping 2 of those intersecting points to my right bottom and my right top. Then I'm placing the coffee cup on that top intersecting point and doing likewise for the coffee maker, which I'm just flipping for stylistic effect. Clearly you can see I made a mistake here. And I am placing it on one of the intersecting points in the grid as well and resizing and reshaping things to create an interesting and cohesive composition. You can also see I'm using the overlapping technique by placing the coffee pot behind the cheesecake to create the illusion of 3-dimensional depth. I decided to move the 2 text layers over and condense them into one text layer. And I decided to use the negative space on the top left of the composition so that I can add this little slogan. All I expect you to do is select an interesting and thematic font. Because this is very whimsical with the dessert and the coffee, I selected a stylized font that looks like handwriting. You guys can choose whatever font you feel is going to communicate the theme. And then I matched the color of the text with the colors being used throughout the image. So if you drag your mouse over the image, you'll be able to sample some of the reds, oranges, or other colors being used. Then, as before, I double-clicked on the color fill layer so that I could change the disgustingly bright yellow to a more neutral color that would not take away from all the work I did in the design overall. Once again, I'm holding down Control on each of those layers so that I can select them, and I'm using Control G so that I can group them, and then I can apply a very subtle drop shadow. So this is getting repetitive at this point. You guys have seen me apply a drop shadow and group items about 3 or 4 times now. This should be fairly obvious. I just want to create the illusion of 3-dimensional depth, and I'm also copying that same drop shadow to apply to the text to just give it a little bit of oomph and have it create a sense of depth a little bit further, like it's popping out at you from the composition. As you can see, my current selection of artboards is a huge improvement over the template that you were given to start out with. While these are not award-winning compositions, there's nothing new, we didn't try any fancy tools, it's still a huge improvement and they are a lot more visually appealing. So now I'm ready to export my final draft. I want you to submit a multi-page PDF, so you're going to go to File, Export, select Artboards to PDF, and you're going to make sure that you name the file, you select desktop or your flash drive as your destination, and ensure that you have selected the option that says multi-page document. When you select multi-page document, when you export your PDF, you'll be able to see each artboard as a separate page in that document. So please ensure that that is selected. Then you're going to click Run and wait for Photoshop to process your request. Once it has processed your request, you'll be able to preview your PDF and see that all of the artboards are exported correctly.